So perhaps you're curious, what happens before you actually take off on a deployment, whether it's a combat deployment or non-combat deployment? So let's talk about that. What's up, my friends? Welcome to an all new video. I'm US Army veteran Christopher Chaos, and in this video we're gonna be talking about what happens before you take off on a deployment. Specifically, probably combat deployment, but a lot of the stuff still relates to non-combat deployments as well. I've never done any non-combat deployments. All the deployments I did were combat deployments to a combat zone. So there may be a little bit of things here and there, but for the most part, a lot of the stuff is pretty much the same. Now, if this is the kind of content you're interested in, learning about deployments, learning about the Army life, whatever the case might be, well, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, maybe think about doing that. Hit that subscribe button. Also, even think about clicking on that bell to get alerts as soon as new videos go live, to include the live streams and become a part of that awesome notification platoon. So let's dive into this and let's talk about what happens before you take off on a deployment. So just a quick backstory, if you're not familiar, I deployed twice to Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, so that is my experience with what happens to me before a combat deployment, and a lot of it still applies, all right? There may be a little bit of things here and there that they've added to it, but for the most part, a lot of the stuff is still the same. Now, one of the first and very important things that you're gonna do before a deployment, even a combat deployment or non-combat deployment, is train. You gotta train for that deployment. A lot of times when it's a non-combat deployment, sometimes the point of that deployment is training, but for combat deployments, right, you have a mission to do. So you gotta be trained up on how to execute that mission properly. So that means going to the field, it means going to the National Training Center, specifically for like deployments for Iraq and Afghanistan, because it's a desert environment, so they want you to get that experience in a desert environment, so the National Training Center is great for that kind of a thing. So that's pretty common. Going to the National Training Center is usually a pretty common one for going and doing training for desert environments. I actually have a video that talks about the NTC, so if you want to check that out, I'll pop it up in a little card up here, so you can click on that. Maybe remember to come back to this part of the video to click on it after the video is done, whatever the case is, and you can learn about the National Training Center. But that is usually pretty common. Field problems to kind of prepare for it, the National Training Center, maybe once or twice. It also depends on when you kind of show up to the unit. A lot of times if you show up to the unit just before they're about to deploy, you may only get in one field problem, maybe none. It just kind of depends sometimes. If you've been with that unit for a while and they know about this deployment quite a ways out, they're probably training like a year out for this thing, maybe 6 months out to this thing, and you might have time to go to the field multiple times, at least go to the National Training Center probably once, somewhere's in there, whatever the case might be. Along with it is usually weapons qualification. You usually want to make sure you're up to date on weapons qualification, make sure your sights are dialed in. Sometimes this also happens like in country. I remember like during my first deployment, we went to Kuwait at first. You know, we spent about a month in Kuwait before we moved into Iraq. And while we were in Kuwait, we used the ranges that we had there in Kuwait near Camp Buehring to be able to kind of qualify with the weapons, make sure our sights were dialed in properly, and everything was good with that. My second deployment, I was in Baghdad, and they had this little range that was just outside of Baghdad. I think the police, I think, used that range or whatever, but we would also use it as well, and sometimes we would go over that range, I think, shortly after we first got there to make sure everything was good and everything was dialed in on our sights and everybody was still up to date on knowing how to shoot, I guess, and making sure you're proficient at the skills. Now, another thing you might do is cultural training to learn a little bit about the culture, maybe a little bit about the language, to the area you're gonna go to. I remember doing this for my first deployment, but I don't believe we did it for my second deployment. Before my first deployment, I remember we went to this week-long course where we learned a little bit of like basic Arabic, some of the phrases, some of the culture, just to learn a little bit about some of the stuff. I think we even got this little handy-dandy handbook that I actually still have inside of here. But I remember we had this like basic little handbook that had a bunch of phrases and stuff. This was actually from the Defense Language Institute for Iraqi Basics, some language survival guide. And this is actually from 2003, so maybe there's a better version out there by now. But yeah, I think the main thing I always remembered was Irfa Edek, which I think was like hands on your head. That was the phrase for some reason I still remember. And then the key thing you go through is what is called SRP. It's basically this location that you'll go through and do a bunch of like medical screenings, a bunch of, you know, physical screenings, a bunch of all sorts of stuff to make sure you're fit to be able to go on this deployment, I guess, essentially. During that, you're doing things like, you know, checking to make sure you're up to date on like dental, vision, your shots. No, not those kind of shots. I mean, you might do that before deployment, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Now, as far as shots go, there was, I remember a bunch of shots that I got before I deployed. I had to get anthrax before my first deployment. They kind of started going away from that, but then they kind of went back to it after my second deployment. I had to get booster shots while I was in Iraq the second time. I'm not sure if they still kind of implement anthrax, but anthrax was a pretty big one that you had to do for shots on. I remember you had to do the really big one for my first deployment, you know, before you took off on it, was smallpox, which that one really, really sucks. I actually still have a scar from it somewheres on my arm in the tattoo somewheres around here, but that one leaves a scar. You're gonna have a scar from that smallpox shot. You have to get a shot, and then you have to keep it covered for like a week, and you can't scratch it, otherwise you can spread it and it can do all sorts of damage to your body, and you have to like really take care of it when you're showering. That shot really sucks. If you ever have to get a smallpox shot, that one sucks. There were a lot of other routine shots you had to give, but that's a really big part of it too, is just making sure you update on the shots, plus whatever shots that may be necessary for the environment you're going to. I remember they also have like the females, you know, do a pregnancy test to make sure they're not going to deploy while they're pregnant. There's a lot of like mental kind of screenings and all sorts of stuff that kind of goes involved with that. They also do things like updating, you know, your power of attorney, so that if you need to have someone take care of your finances while you're deployed or take care of certain things, you can do that. Maybe a will, if you need to like update a will. So a lot of that stuff is all taken care of there at SRP. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what SRP stands for. I probably included it down below after I edited this video, but off the top of my head, I don't remember what it stands for. But essentially, it's probably not that important. It's just a place you go to take care of all this stuff medically, mentally, you know, all sorts of like things like wills and everything that you have to do to get ready for that deployment. Another thing you're gonna have to do is pack up your equipment. And obviously, maybe a key thing that you probably realize that is gonna happen, but there's a lot more to it than just simply let's pack up and let's take off. You have like multiple bags that you'll probably have to pack. You'll have like some bags that'll go with you when you're traveling, and then some that maybe you don't need right away, and just to kind of lighten the load, you'll have them go inside of a Connex. If you're not aware of what a Connex is, it's a big metal container that our Army uses, a lot of shipment yards use, whatever the case is. But usually you have your unit has its own Connex, your own platoon Connex. The equipment gets loaded inside of, things you don't need right away. Sometimes your A bag or your B bag, that's how you usually kind of have it categorized. You usually have one bag that's labeled your A bag, another bag that's labeled your B bag, and they'll designate which bag they want you to put inside the Connex because it's maybe additional things you don't need right away. So you'll pack up a lot of stuff inside of this Connex, and that's a pain in the ass to do as well, because you're packing all this stuff in there, and then for those veterans out there, people in the Army that dealt with Connexes, you probably know the hassle of dealing with Connexes. You have to do a lot of things of packing it in there properly, and then whatever extra space is in that Connex, you have to fill it with something. So you have to do this blocking and bracing using wood and everything to kind of brace it. That way, if the container was to shift in some way, the contents of that container doesn't shift. So you have to keep all that stuff really nice and tight in there. So it's a little bit of a process, a little bit of a hassle if you're one of the individuals stuck kind of blocking and bracing that Connex and packing that Connex and everything. But all that stuff will go inside of there. Your equipment, your A bag. A lot of times you'll have extra room for like maybe a extra, foot locker or something. So if you want to have some personal items you want to throw in there, you can do that. Commonly people is what they'll do is maybe they have like a small TV, maybe they have a guitar, I've done that before, maybe other items that you can't really bring with you on the plane when you actually deploy, so you put them inside the Connex and you'll get that stuff later on. So that's a common one that people would do, is like maybe guitars, maybe small TVs, certain other things that they can fit inside of a foot locker. They pack it up inside there, goes inside the Connex, and then maybe about a month or so into that deployment, maybe you'd receive that Connex, maybe even earlier, it just kind of depends sometimes on the scenario, but then you unpack that Connex, you get that foot locker out and secure your foot locker, and then you have access to all those items that maybe you additionally brought that you didn't really have the extra room to be able to carry with you on the plane. Sometimes that includes vehicles. My first deployment we did that with vehicles, but the second one they got a little bit smarter about it, and they decided, hey, so we don't have to deal with packing up our vehicles, we're just going to sign for the other unit's vehicles. And then that kind of saved the government a little bit of money because they weren't having to ship equipment back and forth as far as vehicles and other things. So that may be a factor. Sometimes there may be a case where limited equipment might get shipped out there because maybe they don't have that equipment for you to fall in on, so you have to bring it from the States and bring it out there. So you might have to do some railhead operations of like loading up these vehicles onto a railhead that maybe have to go to a port somewhere, so they have to get loaded onto a boat, and sometimes you have individuals that'll get sent out to be responsible for loading those vehicles or equipment onto the boat, so that way it can go out onto the ship to get taken out to that country, and then you have other individuals that'll be designated to kind of receive that stuff off the boat as well. So sometimes that plays into it. Currently, a lot of times, if we already have other units occupied in that area, it just saves the government money by just signing for their equipment and taking over their equipment. And then when that unit goes back to the United States, then they probably left their equipment behind because they probably did the same thing. Or if they're the ones that brought the equipment, now you're just taking over their equipment, so they don't have to send it back, then they might just have to like get new equipment from someone else who's about to deploy or something like that. But sometimes your vehicles sometimes play a factor in there, and you have to send that stuff out and receive it and all that kind of stuff. So that's a lot of the main bulk of what you're doing before a deployment, whether it's combat deployment or non-combat deployment. You know, you have to go through that medical screening to make sure you're up to date on shots and all that kind of stuff. And then you're doing other things, you know, like, you know, packing up stuff and doing maybe a little bit of training here and there. So for those of you that are kind of curious as to what do you do before you actually deploy, well, hopefully that facilitates that. Now, if any of you are kind of curious about some other factors maybe that kind of happen before a deployment, well, then make sure to leave those comments down in the comment section down below. I'll do my best to answer the ones that I can. Maybe some of my Army viewers or veteran viewers can help me out with certain other ones maybe. And then if any of you who are currently in the Army or maybe some veterans yourself have some experience with some deployments, whether they're combat or non-combat deployments, and there's other things you want to add to the story as far as things that happen that you've dealt with before a deployment, maybe drop those in the comments as well. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to show a little bit of love by hitting that thumbs up for me if you would. Also think about sharing the video with maybe individuals who might enjoy this type of content. If you want to check out some of the links down in the description, do so. I got links to my social media, affiliate links, all sorts of stuff. I'm Christopher Chaos. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. See ya.